A historical mystery lay hidden in plain sight for nearly 1,000 years. This is the true story of the Viking voyages to America, a tale not of myth, but of wooden ships and very real courage. By the end, you will understand exactly how a band of Norse explorers reached the New World centuries before Columbus, and why their stunning achievement was almost erased from history. What forced them to abandon their promised land, and how did the only proof of their journey survive as a whispered fireside story? What does it feel like to stand on a foreign shore, knowing you are the first of your people to ever see it? The truth of their journey was written not in stone, but in story. For centuries, the only evidence that Vikings had ever set foot in America existed in two ancient Icelandic manuscripts, known as the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red. These were not dry historical records, but family epics passed down by word of mouth around smoky hearths for generations before finally being written on vellum. To the academic world of the 19th and early 20th centuries, they were beautiful literature but little more. They spoke of a lush, forested coast the explorers called Vinland, a place of wild grapes and towering timber, reached after a perilous voyage westward from their settlements in Greenland. It sounded like a fantasy, a heroic legend no more credible than tales of Atlantis. How could a people from the frozen north, using only open wooden boats, have possibly crossed the treacherous North Atlantic and found a new continent? The chasm between these whispered sagas and the solid, document-based history taught in universities was simply too wide to bridge. The Vikings were confined to the pages of European history, their American adventure dismissed as a charming myth. This skepticism, however, overlooked the remarkable people at the heart of these stories. To understand how the voyage was even possible, you have to first understand the Viking world at its peak. These were not just raiders, though they were fearsome in that role. They were master shipwrights and unparalleled navigators of their age. Their longships, with their shallow drafts and flexible clinker-built hulls, were miracles of maritime engineering. They could sail up rivers for raiding, yes, but they could also withstand the open ocean's fury. A Nar, the broader, deeper cargo vessel, was the workhorse of exploration and settlement, capable of carrying families, livestock, and supplies across vast distances. Their navigation was a blend of profound skill and keen observation. Without compasses, they used a sun shadow board to track latitude, read the waves and winds, watched the flight paths of birds, and navigated by the stars. They possessed a culture built on mobility and a relentless drive to see what lay over the horizon. Greenland itself, settled by Eric the Red around 985 AD, was a testament to this spirit, a remote, harsh outpost that became a launching pad for the next, even greater leap. So we begin with a contradiction. On one side, a rich oral tradition filled with specific, consistent details about lands to the west. On the other, a complete absence of physical proof, leading scholars to relegate the entire account to the realm of fiction. The sagas slept, and the Viking chapter in American history remained a closed book, a tantalizing possibility forever just out of reach. What would it take to wake that story from its long slumber? What kind of evidence could possibly convince the world that the myths were in fact a true map? The key to unlocking the Vinland mystery lay in the character of the man who built its doorstep. Erik Thorvaldsson, known to history as Eric the Red, was a force of nature, banished from Norway for a killing, then later exiled from Iceland for another. He was a man with a temper as fierce as his red hair and beard. But he was also a leader of immense vision and cunning. With nowhere else to go, he turned his exile into an opportunity, sailing west into the unknown around the year 982. What he found was a land of staggering contrasts, a place of immense glaciers, and in the deep fjords, pockets of green pasture. He spent 3 years exploring its coastline, searching for the best places a community could survive. When his exile ended, he returned to Iceland not as an outcast but as a promoter with a brilliant sales pitch. He called this new, harsh frontier Greenland. The name was a masterstroke, a piece of hopeful branding designed to lure families desperate for land, and it worked. Around 25 ships set sail with him, carrying perhaps 500 men, women, and children, along with their livestock and all their worldly goods. They established two main communities, the eastern and western settlements, clinging to life on the very fringe of the habitable world. Life in Norse Greenland was a constant negotiation with extremity. These were farmers, not just hunters. They raised sheep and cattle, built stone and turf houses that huddled low against the wind, and traded walrus ivory and polar bear skins back to Europe for the iron, timber, and grain they couldn't produce themselves. Their world was a narrow ribbon of green between the towering ice cap and the unforgiving sea. They maintained their Norse identity fiercely, building churches and following the old ways, yet they were utterly isolated. A voyage back to Iceland or Norway was a dangerous, months-long undertaking. This isolation bred a unique self-reliance and a deep, intimate knowledge of the North Atlantic. They became the world's foremost experts on sailing those icy waters, and it was this very isolation, this scarcity, that would ultimately propel their sons and daughters westward. Greenland had many things, but one critical resource was missing: good timber. Their ships and buildings relied on driftwood or expensive imports. The sagas tell us that a man named Bjarni Herjolfsson, blown off course while sailing from Iceland to Greenland, was the first to sight a strange, forested coast to the west. He didn't land, but his report of this wooded wonderland would have spread like wildfire through the settlements. For a community living on the bare edge of the world, the mere idea of a land rich in lumber was a siren's call. It was a need that would soon turn a tale of accidental discovery into a deliberate, family-led mission of exploration. The first European to lay eyes on the American continent never set foot upon it. His name was Bjarni Herjolfsson, and his story is one of frustrating caution, a navigator's discipline overriding an explorer's curiosity. The year was around 986. Bjarni was a prosperous merchant following his father to the new settlement in Greenland. He arrived in Iceland only to learn his father's ship had already departed. True to his filial duty, Bjarni decided to press on, setting sail into the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic with only a heading and a description to guide him. Then the weather turned. For days, a dense fog and a punishing northerly wind seized his ship, a nar laden with trade goods. The sun and stars vanished. In that grey, featureless void, the crew lost all sense of direction. They were utterly, terrifyingly adrift at the mercy of a sea that seemed to have no end. Can you feel that disorientation, the creeping dread as familiar markers disappear, replaced by the endless, heaving sameness of the ocean? They sailed on, hope thinning with each passing day, their world reduced to the creak of timber and the sigh of the waves. Then the fog lifted, and there, rising from the sea, was land, but it was all wrong. This was not the stark, glacier-carved majesty of Greenland. This coastline was low and heavily forested, a rolling, verdant mystery that stretched beyond sight. The sagas describe the crew's astonishment. They saw no mountains, no icy fjords, only an unbroken blanket of trees. Bjarni's men, eager and relieved, begged him to go ashore. They needed fresh water and firewood, but Bjarni, ever the pragmatic merchant, refused. He was a man on a mission, not an explorer. This place was unknown and potentially dangerous. His father was waiting in Greenland. With a resolve that must have seemed maddening to his thirsty crew, he gave the order to turn the ship away from that inviting shore and back out to sea. He skirted the coastline, noting its features. He saw a second land, this one flat and wooded, and then a third with mountains and glaciers. Still, he did not land. Using his profound skill, he deduced these lands lay southwest of Greenland. He set a course north and east, and after a tense voyage, finally reached the safety of his father's fjord. In the warmth of the longhouse, surrounded by settlers hungry for news, Bjarni told his tale. He described the strange, wooded coasts he had seen. His story was met with interest, perhaps, but also with a certain practicality. He was criticized for his lack of curiosity, for not landing and investigating this new world. For years, his account was a curious anecdote, a sailor's yarn about a land that might not even exist. But the seed had been planted. In a community starved for timber, the mere mention of a forested coast was a powerful, lingering dream. Bjarni's accidental discovery was not a failure. It was the first piece of a map, a whispered coordinate passed between generations. He proved something lay beyond the western horizon. The next voyage would not be one of reluctant discovery, but of bold, deliberate ambition. The question was no longer if something was out there, but who would be brave enough to sail straight for it. Leif Erikson was not a man content with stories. He was a man of action, the son of Eric the Red, raised in the harsh crucible of Greenland. While others debated Bjarni Herjolfsson's tale, Leif saw a blueprint. He understood that an accidental sighting was not enough. It demanded a deliberate voyage, a mission of intent. So, around the year 1000, he did something brilliantly practical. He went directly to Bjarni and purchased the very ship that had first glimpsed the western shores. He gathered a crew of trusted men, not just sailors, but scouts and hunters preparing for a journey of unknown duration. Their goal was not just to confirm a story, but to explore a possibility, to find the resources their Greenlandic home so desperately lacked. This was no desperate flight from a storm. This was a calculated expedition into the unknown, led by a man with the legacy of a founder in his blood. Leif made a critical navigational decision. He would retrace Bjarni's route, but in reverse. He began where Bjarni had ended up, sailing from Greenland out into the open ocean, aiming for the last landmark Bjarni had described. The first land they sighted was a desolate, unforgiving place. The sagas describe it as a flat land of great stone slabs, with glaciers inland and a coastline of rock. There were no forests, no welcoming harbors. Leif named it Helluland, which means slab land. To his crew, it must have seemed a bleak and disappointing sight, a world of stone and ice. Scholars today believe this was almost certainly Baffin Island, a frozen, treeless landscape that offered little to Norse settlers, but Leif did not turn back. He had a process, a method. He marked it, named it, and moved on, trusting the saga's promise of better lands to the south. They sailed onward, following the coastline south. Days passed, the landscape slowly beginning to change. Then they saw it. A long coast of dense, dark forest came into view, fronted by endless stretches of brilliant white sand. After the barren stone of Helluland, this was a vision of abundance. Here was the timber they sought, an entire continent's worth of it, right down to the water's edge. Leif named this place Markland, meaning forest land. This is widely identified as the coast of Labrador. For the Greenlanders, this alone would have made the voyage a staggering success. They could have loaded their ship with precious lumber and sailed home as heroes, but the sagas hint that Leif was listening to more than just Bjarni's old story. Perhaps he had spoken to others, to men who had heard whispers of even richer lands. Or perhaps he simply felt that pull, that explorer's instinct that whispers there is always something more just beyond the horizon. He knew the value of Markland, but he would not stop there. The true prize, the place that would burn its name into history, was still waiting to be found. South from the forested coast of Markland, the world began to soften. The air grew warmer, carrying unfamiliar scents on the breeze. The crew of the lone Nar would have noticed the change in the water's color, the different birds circling their mast, the very taste of the salt spray. They were sailing into a new kind of wilderness, one that felt less like a harsh frontier and more like a promise. Then they found it. The ship rounded a headland and a breathtaking vista unfolded before them. A sheltered bay, its waters calm and deep. Rivers teeming with salmon so plentiful you could almost walk across their backs. Meadows of tall, sweet grass rolling back from the shore, ideal for the cattle they had brought. And beyond it all, forests of massive oak and pine, and tangles of vines heavy with dark, wild grapes. For Leif Erikson and his Norse crew, this was more than just new land. This was Vinland, the good. The name itself, Vinland, speaks to what stunned them most. In Old Norse, Vin can mean either wine or pasture, a duality that perfectly captured the place's twin miracles of fertility. They had found a land that offered everything Greenland lacked. Here, the winter sun held more warmth. The ground did not permanently freeze. The salmon ran thicker than any river in Iceland. And the grapes, those small, tart fruits, represented something almost mythical. In their homelands, wine was a luxury import, a drink for chieftains and kings, symbolizing wealth and southern abundance. To find vines growing wild, as if the land itself was offering them a lord's feast, must have felt like a divine endorsement. This was not a place to merely visit. This was a place where a Norse society could truly thrive. They did not just camp, they built, choosing a prime location near the sheltered bay, likely on the northern tip of Newfoundland. They constructed substantial, permanent dwellings. The sagas call them Leifsbu, their Leif's booths, but that modest name belies their ambition. These were not temporary shelters. They were large, turf-walled longhouses built with the timber that was now in endless supply. Picture the scene as the first winter settled in. Inside the great hall, a central fire pit crackles, its smoke curling up towards the roof hole. The walls, lined with timber and packed earth, hold the warmth at bay. The smell of roasting fish and stewed game fills the air. Outside, their cattle and sheep, which had survived the voyage, graze on fodder cut from the meadows. For men and women raised on the austere beauty of Greenland and Iceland, this first Vinland winter was a season of profound comfort and awe. There was no desperate struggle for survival here. The land provided. They had successfully transplanted their entire way of life to a continent no European knew existed. In that warm, smoky hall, surrounded by the creak of new timber and the sounds of their own language, they must have felt like the luckiest people in the world. They had found their promised land, but a paradise shared is a paradise challenged, and the whispers in the deep woods beyond their settlement were not just the wind. Yet a settlement of turf and timber cannot remain hidden forever. The location of Vinland, for so long a beautiful mystery, was finally pinned to the map not by a historian in a library, but by a husband and wife team following a hunch along a windswept coast. In the summer of 1960, Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and archaeologist Anne Stein Ingstad arrived at a remote fishing outpost on the northern tip of Newfoundland called Meadows. Local residents pointed them toward some overgrown, grassy mounds near the shore, formations that looked unnatural. When the Ingstads began to dig, the earth gave up its secret. They found the unmistakable, ghostly outlines of buildings, not the rounded pits of indigenous dwellings, but the classic rectangular footprints of Norse longhouses with their central hearths and bowed walls. This was not a temporary campfire site. This was a base. The excavation that followed over the next 7 years would reveal a full-scale Norse settlement, a perfect match for the saga descriptions of Leif's camp. Here was the proof that had eluded scholars for centuries, written not on parchment, but in the very soil. Walking through Meadows today, you can still feel the presence of that small, bold community. 8 distinct buildings have been uncovered, clustered around a small brook. 3 of them are large halls, each big enough to house between 20 and 30 people. Their walls were built in the classic Norse style, with layers of sod cut from the meadow and stacked over a wooden frame, creating insulation so effective it would have made the North Atlantic winters bearable. But a settlement is more than just sleeping quarters. The true clincher, the piece of evidence that silenced all remaining doubt, was the discovery of a smithy. Just outside one of the halls, archaeologists found a simple stone hearth surrounded by piles of iron slag, the waste product from heating and working bog iron. The Norse were smelting and forging iron nails and tools right there in the New World. This was a technology unknown to the indigenous peoples of the region at that time. It was a signature, a clear cultural fingerprint left in the landscape. The artifacts tell a story of daily life and distant connections. A small, bronze-ringed pin of a style common in Norse Ireland was found, likely used to fasten a cloak. A stone spindle wall spoke of women spinning wool for clothing. Most tellingly, butternuts and pieces of wood from trees like white walnut were discovered species that do not grow in Newfoundland, but are found hundreds of miles to the south along the Gulf of St. Lawrence. This tells us Meadows was not just a random landing spot. It was a strategic gateway, a repair station, and overwintering camp for expeditions venturing further south into richer, warmer lands the Norse called Vinland proper. You can almost hear the sounds that once filled this bay, the rhythmic hammering from the smithy shaping a new rivet for a ship, the chatter of crew members repairing a hull on the beach, the lowing of cattle in a nearby meadow. This was a living, breathing foothold on a continent. For a few short years, the smoke from those Norse hearths curled into the North American sky, a tiny, defiant signal in a vast and ancient land. Yet a camp, no matter how well built, is only as secure as the relationships around it. The sagas hint that the idyllic life at Vinland did not last. The reason for its abandonment lies not in the harshness of the land, but in the people who had called it home for millennia. The longhouses at Meadows were a beginning, not an end. This gateway settlement solves one great mystery only to reveal a far more intriguing one. If this windswept Newfoundland site was their base, then where exactly were they going? The answer lies in the quiet evidence left behind. Among the artifacts recovered were the shells of butternuts and the wood of trees like white walnut, species that simply do not grow in the cold climate of northern Newfoundland. To find them, the Norse would have had to sail south, perhaps deep into the warmer waters of the Gulf of St. Lawrence, or even beyond. These humble botanical clues are like tiny, silent maps. They tell us the people at Meadows were not just hunkering down for winter. They were launching expeditions. The sagas describe Vinland not as a single campsite, but as a vast region, a land of many wonders. So the pressing question becomes, how far did their voyages truly reach? Was the fabled Vinland just another name for Newfoundland itself, or was it a distant shore hundreds of miles to the south? Historians and archaeologists have been piecing together this puzzle for decades, and the debate is wonderfully alive. One compelling theory places the heart of Vinland along the coasts of New Brunswick or Nova Scotia. These regions have the rich, deciduous forests, the wild grapes, and the salmon-filled rivers that so captivated the Norse explorers. The Miramichi River area in New Brunswick, for instance, matches many saga descriptions perfectly. Others look further to the coast of New England. Parts of Massachusetts and Rhode Island also have native grapes and a climate that would have felt miraculously mild to Greenlanders. There is even a controversial, though widely disputed, theory pointing to a runestone found in Minnesota, suggesting incredible inland journeys. While most scholars dismiss that particular artifact, it highlights the powerful allure of the unknown. The truth is, Meadows was a strategic outpost, a repair station and overwintering hub. From there, smaller crews in smaller boats could have coasted south with the currents, following the shoreline for weeks, exploring river mouths and bays. They would have been searching for the very best stands of timber, the densest grapevines, the most ideal places for a permanent colony. Each summer expedition would return to the base with stories and samples, expanding their mental map of this new world. So we are left with a fascinating image. The Norse footprint in America was not a single set of ruins on a Newfoundland beach. It was a network of potential landfalls, a scatter of temporary campsites and explored coastlines that may stretch over 1,000 miles. Vinland was likely not a dot on a map but a corridor. This makes the story not smaller but grander. Their achievement was not just in reaching a shore but in systematically exploring a continent's edge. They named its parts Helluland, Markland, Vinland, and they began to understand its scale. Yet for all this exploration, no second settlement has ever been found. Why did they establish such a perfect gateway, gather such promising intelligence, and then simply leave? The answer to that question lies not in the land, but in the people they found there. Leif Erikson's success cast a long shadow, one that his younger brother, Thorvald, felt compelled to step into. With Leif's base at Vinland now a proven reality, Thorvald organized his own expedition, sailing west with a single ship and a crew of 30 men, eager to build upon his brother's legacy. They arrived safely at Leif's camp, the longhouses standing empty but ready, a furnished promise in the wilderness. For 2 years, they used this outpost as their home, venturing out in smaller boats to chart the coastline, to explore the endless forests and inlets of this new world. Their mission was one of assessment, to see if this land could truly support a permanent colony. For a time, it must have seemed not only possible but inevitable. Then, during one of these coastal surveys, everything changed. They rounded a wooded cape and found, pulled up on a beach, 3 strange vessels. They were not dugout canoes, but boats made of a framework covered in animal hides. And sleeping beneath them, sheltered from the sun, were 9 men. In that frozen, breathless moment, 2 worlds that had evolved a hemisphere apart came face to face. The Norse reaction, as the Saga coldly records it, was swift and brutal. They attacked, killing 8 of the sleepers before they could even rise. 1 man managed to escape, vanishing into the forest. It was a catastrophic first encounter, a greeting written in blood. The Norse had just made first contact with the people they would come to call the Skraelings. The word itself is telling, a Norse term often used for indigenous peoples they considered strange or different, carrying connotations of weakness or otherness. In that single, violent act on a silent beach, Thorvald's crew had sown the seeds of a conflict they could not possibly comprehend. They had announced their presence not as explorers but as conquerors. And the land would answer. The survivors' escape guaranteed that answer would come. It did the following summer. While the Norse were repairing their ship, a great flotilla of hide boats suddenly appeared, emerging from the fog like ghosts. This was not a small hunting party. It was a force, a community coming to confront the strangers who had attacked their people. The Saga describes a tense, silent standoff. Trade was attempted, with the Norse offering lengths of red cloth in exchange for furs, but the moment turned when a Norse bull kept with the camp began to bellow. The unfamiliar, terrifying sound spooked the Skraelings, who took it as a threat or a sign of magic. They broke off the trade and fled. The Norse, fearing an imminent attack, retreated to a defensible position behind their beached ship. They were right to be afraid. The Skraelings returned, this time with a purpose. A rain of arrows and stones fell upon the Norse position. The battle was fierce and chaotic. The Norse shields and armor gave them an advantage, and they held their line. But in the fray, their leader, Thorvald Erikson, was struck. An arrow found a gap in his defenses, burying itself deep in his armpit. He pulled it out, knowing the wound was mortal. As his life bled into the Vinland soil, he spoke words that would echo down through the Saga. He told his men to bury him there on the headland, with a cross at his head and another at his feet. He said they should call the place Crossanes, Cross Point. His final wish was a poignant mix of his old faith and his new reality. He wanted to claim this land for Christendom, even as he lay dying because of it. Then he added, with a bleak and prescient honesty, "It seems fate has willed that I should settle here but a little while." With their leader dead, the remaining Norse had no heart to stay. They spent a 3rd grim winter at the camp, then loaded their ship with timber and grapes and sailed back to Greenland. they brought with them a cargo of grief and a warning. Vinland was a land of abundance, but it was not empty. It was defended by people who would fight for their home. Thorvald's grave on that distant headland marked more than a personal tragedy. It was the first European grave in America, and a stark monument to the fatal misunderstanding that would define so much of the history to come. Thorvald's death was a warning, but not a deterrent. If anything, it made Vinland an even greater challenge, a prize that demanded a more serious effort. This is where the story shifts from exploration to attempted colonization, and the man at its center was not a hot-headed younger son, but a seasoned leader. Thorfinn Karlsefni was an Icelandic merchant of considerable wealth and reputation. He understood risk and reward in his bones. Around the year 1010, he looked at the reports from Vinland, the timber, the grapes, the pastures, and saw not just an adventure but an investment. He decided to mount an expedition on a scale never before attempted. This would not be a voyage of discovery or a seasonal camp. This was an attempt to transplant a full, functioning Norse community across the ocean. Karlsefni's fleet likely consisted of several ships carrying a staggering cargo of hope and necessity. There were over 100 men and women, a complete cross-section of Norse society. They brought cattle, sheep, and goats, the foundational livestock of their agrarian life. They packed tools, seeds, and all the domestic goods needed to build a new world from scratch. Crucially, Karlsefni's own wife, Gudrid Thorbjarnardóttir, joined the voyage. Her presence signaled this was a permanent move, a commitment to founding a dynasty on this foreign shore. They sailed to the established base at Leif's camp and then moved beyond it, seeking the very best location for their settlement. They found a spot with deep soil, protected harbors, and abundant resources, a place the sagas call hub. Here they built not just longhouses but a community. They fenced pastures for their animals, planted crops they'd brought from home, and established a rhythm of life that must have felt for a time like a dream fulfilled. Life in this new Vinland settlement had a strange, almost surreal quality of normalcy. Children played by the brook, women like Gudrid ground grain and spun wool from their sheep. Men fished the teeming waters and hunted in the endless woods, and then, a milestone that marked their deepest roots in this soil, Gudrid gave birth to a son. They named him Snorri Thorfinnsson. In that moment, the fate of the colony became personal. Snorri was not just a baby, he was the first known child of European descent born in the Americas, a living symbol of their commitment to this land. His birth was a declaration, we are here to stay. Their relationship with the Skraelings, the indigenous people, began not with violence but with cautious trade. One day, a large group appeared at the edge of the settlement. Remembering past conflicts, the Norse were wary, but Karlsefni, the merchant, saw an opportunity. He ordered his people to hold up shields as a non-threatening barrier and sent a small party forward. The trade that followed was a scene of profound cultural disconnect. The Norse offered lengths of vibrant red cloth, which the Skraelings eagerly accepted, tying strips of it around their heads. In return, the Norse received pelts of grey furs, likely beaver or squirrel. Both sides saw immense value in what the other offered. For the Norse, furs were luxury goods, wealth to be traded back in Europe. For the Skraelings, the red cloth was a dazzling novelty, a color perhaps unlike any they could produce. For a brief period, this exchange worked. The Skraelings would arrive, lay out their furs, and retreat. The Norse would then lay out a length of cloth and also retreat. It was a silent, ritualized barter conducted with a distance that spoke of mutual fear and fascination. But this fragile peace was built on a foundation of profound misunderstanding. The two cultures viewed the world, property, and each other through utterly different lenses. The Norse, with their concept of land ownership and fences, saw the Skraelings as visitors to their domain. The Skraelings likely saw the Norse as strange, temporary neighbors in a land that was eternally theirs. The tension finally snapped over something small and vital: milk. According to the sagas, a Skraeling, curious about the Norse cattle, took a taste of the milk or whey the settlers were producing. He found it delicious. Word spread. Suddenly, the Skraelings weren't just interested in cloth. They wanted what the cattle produced. They began to focus their trade demands on the very sustenance of the Norse colony. To Karlsefni and his people, this was an alarming escalation. The cattle were their lifeline, the key to their survival through winter. Letting the Skraelings develop a taste for this resource felt like an existential threat. The atmosphere curdled from wary trade to cold suspicion. The final break came suddenly. A Skraeling, perhaps in a dispute over a trade item or spooked by the Norse bull as before, was killed by one of the settlers. In an instant, the silent trade was over. The Skraelings vanished back into the forest. The Norse knew what came next. They fortified their position, expecting an attack. When it came, it was overwhelming. The saga describes a fierce battle, with the Skraelings using slings to hurl a great, dark sphere that made a terrifying noise when it landed. Some scholars suggest this could have been a bladder filled with blood or gravel, a psychological weapon. Though the Norse defenders, with their superior weapons and armor, held their ground, the message was clear. They were not just facing a war party. They were facing the collective will of a people who saw them as dangerous intruders. The attacks or the threat of them did not cease. For 3 long years, Karlsefni's colony lived under a shadow of fear. The dream of a peaceful, prosperous Vinland was crumbling. The land was still abundant, but it was not theirs. Every foraging party risked an ambush. Every sound in the forest at night could be a threat. The cost of staying, measured in constant vigilance and blood, began to outweigh the bounty of the grapes and timber. The decision, when it came, was a practical one. The merchant in Karlsefni calculated the risk and found it too high. They gathered their people, their surviving livestock, and whatever valuable timber and furs they could carry. They left their longhouses to the wind and the grass, boarded their ships, and sailed back to Greenland. They brought with them stories, furs, and a toddler named Snorri, but not a colony. Thorfinn Karlsefni's great experiment in transatlantic settlement was over. It had succeeded in every material way, yet failed in the one way that mattered most. It could not secure a peace. The door to Vinland, opened with such hope, was slowly swinging shut. But why did it close for good? What changed in the wider world that would make this bold venture not just a failure, but a forgotten one? The story of Vinland is not just one of exploration and trade, but of raw human nature pushed to its limits. And no figure embodies that brutal edge more than Freydis Eiriksdottir, the daughter of Eric the Red. Her tale, preserved in the saga of the Greenlanders, adds a chilling layer of personal drama to the larger narrative of failure. She joined a later expedition led by 2 Icelandic brothers, Thorfinn and Thorhall, a partnership meant to combine resources for a final, serious attempt at establishing a foothold. But from the beginning, the venture was fraught with tension, a clash of personalities simmering in the close quarters of the Vinland camp. The defining moment of her legend comes during a Skraeling attack. As the saga tells it, the Norsemen were fleeing, overwhelmed by the sudden assault. Freydis, who was pregnant, could not keep up. Finding herself alone and facing the advancing warriors, she did something astonishing. She snatched up a sword from a fallen comrade. Then, in a gesture of sheer, terrifying defiance, she tore open her tunic, bared her breast, and slapped it fiercely with the flat of the blade. She let out a fierce war cry. The Skraelings, confronted with this furious, screaming woman, this apparition they could not comprehend, were seized with fear. They turned and fled back to their boats. In that instant, Freydis became the savior of the retreating party, a symbol of savage, untamed courage that shamed the fleeing men. Yet this same woman is depicted with a far darker shade later in the story. The conflict with the Skraelings had broken the spirit of the expedition. The Icelanders wanted to go home. Freydis, however, wished to stay longer, and a bitter dispute erupted. Here, the saga shifts from battlefield heroism to cold, premeditated treachery. Freydis went to the Icelandic brothers in secret, telling each one that the other wanted to partner with her and abandon his sibling. She played on their distrust, manipulating them into a state of hostility. Then one morning, she walked out of her longhouse, complaining loudly of being mistreated. She gave her husband a stark ultimatum: kill the Icelanders or she would divorce him. What followed was a massacre. The Icelanders were killed as they slept, and when the Norse men refused to kill the 5 women in their party, Freydis herself took an axe and murdered them all. Her motive was pure greed. She wanted their larger, more seaworthy ship for the voyage back to Greenland. So who was Freydis Eriksdottir? The sagas present us with a profound contradiction. Is she the ultimate Viking heroine, embodying a ferocity that could save a community in its darkest hour? Or is she a ruthless, ambitious schemer, a murderer who used violence to secure property and power? Historians debate how much of her story is literary embellishment, a cautionary tale about greed, or a celebration of pagan female strength in a world increasingly influenced by Christianity. But her enduring presence in the story is crucial. She reminds us that these were not archetypes but complex individuals. They carried with them all the courage, superstition, ambition, and brutality of their age. The New World did not purify them. It simply provided a new, unfiltered stage for their very old human dramas. After the failure of Karlsefni's colony and the bloody saga of Freydis, the great Vinland project seemed to lose its heart. The costs were becoming too clear, the rewards too perilous to hold, but the story was not quite over. A few still dared to sail west, not for glory or settlement, but for something far more practical and far more enduring. Vinland was a prize they could reach, but not a home they could hold. The dream of a permanent Norse colony in America didn't fail for one simple reason, but for a perfect storm of pressures that made staying impossible and forgetting almost inevitable. The first and most fundamental pressure was sheer, overwhelming distance. Think of the supply line. A voyage from Norway to Iceland was a known challenge. From Iceland to Greenland was a leap into the remote, and from Greenland to Vinland was a journey off the edge of their known world. Each leg added risk, time, and uncertainty. Greenland itself, their launching pad, was a precarious society of perhaps 3,000 souls at its peak, clinging to survival on the world's margin. This wasn't a mighty empire sending out colonists. It was a tiny, struggling community trying to establish an even more remote daughter settlement. A colony needs a constant flow of people, tools, and support to grow. For Vinland, that flow was a trickle across 1,000 miles of the most dangerous ocean on Earth. One storm, one lost ship, and the entire venture could be cut off and stranded. They were simply too far from home. Then there were the people who were already home. The Skraelings were not a minor obstacle, they were the decisive factor. The sagas, told from the Norse perspective, still reveal the truth. They were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. This wasn't a conflict between a superior European force and scattered tribes. It was the opposite. The Norse were the tiny, isolated group. They were attempting to carve out a permanent space in a land inhabited by networks of indigenous nations who knew the terrain intimately and could mobilize significant numbers. The Norse had better metal weapons and armor, but that advantage faded against ambushes, attrition, and a population that could replace its losses. Every time the Norse built a fence or a longhouse, they were not building on empty land. They were building on a homeland, and its people were prepared to defend it. The economic model for Vinland collapsed under this reality. It was one thing to send a ship for a summer to cut timber. It was another to maintain a year-round settlement that required constant defense. The cost in lives and constant vigilance simply erased the profit. The grapes and timber were not worth dying for, not when Greenland, for all its hardships, was at least a known and defensible quantity. Ultimately, the pull of Vinland weakened because the push from Greenland wasn't strong enough. What was the compelling reason to go? For a society like the later English or Spanish colonies, the drive was gold, empire, or religious freedom. For the Norse, it was timber and land. Greenland had a limited population and a limited appetite for lumber. Once a few good voyages had brought back holds full of precious oak and pine, the immediate, desperate need was met. The furs were valuable, but so were the walrus ivory and narwhal horns they could acquire much closer to home in the Arctic. The perilous 2-month voyage to a hostile coast began to look less like a brilliant opportunity and more like a foolish risk. The world was changing back in Europe too. The climate was shifting, entering a slow cooling period that would make northern voyages even harder. Trade routes were solidifying to the south and east. The Norse attention turned inward toward their struggles in Greenland and Iceland, and toward the political and religious transformations sweeping Scandinavia. Vinland became a story from the adventurous past, a tale for a winter's night, not a blueprint for the future. So the ships stopped sailing west. The longhouses at Helluland's Meadows were reclaimed by the peat, and the knowledge of that far shore faded from practical memory into the realm of saga and legend. A door to a new world had been opened, held ajar for a few generations, and then quietly allowed to swing shut. But what if that door had never fully closed? What traces of that fleeting contact might have lingered in the centuries that followed, hidden in the stories of the people on both sides of the ocean? So the door to Vinland swung shut, and a profound silence descended. For nearly 500 years, the story of the Norse in America survived not in history books, but in the fragile, flickering light of memory. It was preserved by the people who cared most about their own lineage, the Icelanders. In the 13th and 14th centuries, long after the last ship had returned from Markland, scribes in remote monastic outposts began to write down the old oral tales. They recorded the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red onto precious vellum, capturing the exploits of Leif, Thorfinn, and Freydis for their descendants. These manuscripts were not meant for a European audience. They were family chronicles, local history, treasured heirlooms in a world that had turned inward. While the rest of Europe dreamed of reaching the Indies by sailing east, the Icelanders quietly preserved a story about lands to the west. It was a truth without a context, a map folded away in a drawer no one else ever opened. Then, in 1492, Christopher Columbus made his famous voyage, sponsored by the Spanish crown. He arrived in the Caribbean believing he had reached the outer islands of Asia. His journey was a product of a different geography, a different set of ambitions, and most importantly, a different system of record-keeping. Columbus's voyages were immediately and explosively documented, published, and circulated across a Europe newly equipped with the printing press. His discovery was a public, political, and economic event that ignited a continent. The Norse voyages, by contrast, were private family enterprises from a fading frontier, their records sitting unread in an obscure language on a distant island. There was no mechanism and no reason for that story to enter the mainstream. So when European scholars and mapmakers began to piece together the new geography of the Americas, they worked from Spanish, Portuguese, and later English and French reports. The Norse achievement was not debated or dismissed. It was simply unknown. It had been erased by time, distance, and the sheer, overwhelming noise of the colonial scramble that followed Columbus. Imagine a library where one vital book has been misfiled in a forgotten corner, written in a language no one in the main hall can read. That was the fate of the Vinland sagas. They became a beautiful, curious local legend, a story the Icelanders themselves told but which the wider world had no framework to believe. To a Renaissance scholar in Rome or Paris, the idea that medieval Norse fishermen in open boats could have accomplished such a feat seemed preposterous, a national myth on par with tales of Atlantis. The silence was so complete that when the first English settlers landed at Plymouth Rock, they believed they were the first Europeans to ever contemplate settling on that continent. They walked ashore onto a land that had, centuries earlier, felt the tread of Norse boots and heard the sound of a Norse child crying. The past was not just a foreign country. It was a lost one, yet the story waited, patient as stone, in those Icelandic manuscripts. It survived fires, damp, and neglect. It survived because it was a good story, a true story about courage and failure, and the haunting allure of a green shore beyond the sea. It was a secret kept by an entire nation, a whisper passed down through the long Arctic nights, waiting for the day when someone from outside would finally arrive, listen closely, and have the imagination to believe that the myth might just be a map. A story that powerful was bound to inspire more than just academic curiosity. In the centuries after the Vinland sagas were written down, a deep and persistent desire took root, a longing to find more traces of those bold Norse voyagers, to prove their story extended even further into the heart of the continent. This longing, however, has often walked a fine line between archaeology and obsession, leading to some of the most enduring and heated controversies in American history. The most famous of these is the tale of the Kensington runestone. In 1898, a Swedish immigrant farmer named Olof Oman claimed to have discovered a large, flat stone tangled in the roots of a tree on his property in Kensington, Minnesota. Carved into its face was a message in runic letters, a dire inscription that told of a party of 8 Goths and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland. It described a tragic ambush with 10 men left dead and red with blood. Most startling of all, it was dated to the year 1362. If genuine, the stone would rewrite history, placing Norse explorers deep in North America, over 100 years after the Greenland settlements had faded and a full century before Columbus. The problem, according to the vast majority of linguists and historians, is that it almost certainly is not genuine. The runes used are a mix of styles from different centuries, some of which were not fully deciphered until long after 1362. The language itself contains modern Swedish constructions. The story it tells feels like a pastiche of saga tropes, discovered conveniently at a time when Scandinavian immigrants in the Midwest were eager to claim a deep, noble history in their new land. While some passionate defenders argue for its authenticity, the scholarly consensus is clear. The Kensington runestone is a well-crafted hoax, a piece of 19th-century folk art born from pride and wishful thinking. Other alleged Norse relics dot the landscape, each with its own tantalizing story. In Newport, Rhode Island, a curious round stone tower has stood for centuries. Its origins are murky, and some have proposed it was built as a Norse church or a navigational landmark. Yet architectural historians point to its clear similarities to 17th-century English windmills or governor's powder magazines, and no Norse artifacts have ever been found in association with it. Then there is the main penny, a small silver coin discovered at a Native American archaeological site in Maine. This coin is the real deal, a genuine Norse penny minted in Norway between 1065 and 1080. Its authenticity is not in doubt. The controversy lies in how it got there. Did a Norse traveler drop it during an expedition down the coast, or did it arrive through the vast, intricate indigenous trade networks that span the continent, passed from hand to hand over centuries until it finally came to rest in Maine? That single coin is a perfect metaphor for the challenge. It is a verified piece of the Viking world found in America, but without a clear, direct line back to its original owner. It suggests contact, but not necessarily settlement. These mysteries teach us a crucial lesson in historical detective work. The solid, undeniable proof of L. Ance Ox Meadows sets a standard. It was found through systematic archaeology, its artifacts contextually perfect, its structures exactly matching Norse technology. Extraordinary claims, like a Norse presence in the Midwest, require extraordinary evidence of the same caliber. A single, uncorroborated stone, or a building that resembles later colonial works, or even a genuine coin without a Norse campsite around it, cannot overturn that standard. They are puzzles, not proof. They remind us that the human desire to connect with a romantic past is powerful, and that separating that desire from the slow, careful work of evidence is the only way to honor the true story. The Vikings did reach America. They built a gateway at the edge of the continent. The rest of the map beyond that single proven point remains shaded in tantalizing, unconfirmed possibility. That power of narrative, that ability to hold a truth across centuries, brings us back to the very beginning. Before there were manuscripts or archaeologists, there was the fire. The Viking sagas were not meant to be read in silence. They were born in the deep, dark winters of the north, in the smoky warmth of the longhouse. They were living things passed from memory to memory, shaped by the rhythm of a voice and the crackle of burning wood. They were, in their purest form, the original sleep stories for grown-ups. Think of the scene. The day's work is done. The wind howls outside, pressing against the turf walls. Inside, the central hearth is a pool of light in a sea of shadows. People gather on benches wrapped in furs, their faces painted in flickering orange and black. An elder, or perhaps a skilled storyteller, begins to speak. The voice is not loud, but it carries. It has a cadence, a musicality developed over generations. It tells not of abstract dates, but of people. It tells of Eric the Red's fiery temper, of Leif's quiet determination, of Freydis' terrifying courage. It weaves together the factual and the fantastical without a seam. The voyage across a monster-haunted sea sits beside the precise description of how to smelt bog iron. A tale of trading red cloth for furs is followed by an encounter with a unipt, a mythical one-legged creature. This was not seen as contradiction. It was the texture of truth. The story was a tapestry, and every thread, whether of verified event or symbolic myth, served to make the whole picture stronger, more memorable, more true to the experience of living in a vast and mysterious world. The purpose of these stories was multifaceted. They were entertainment, certainly, a way to pass the interminable winter nights, but they were far more. They were education. A young person listening learned the family lineage, the old routes across the sea, the techniques for survival in a new land, and the consequences of greed or cowardice. They were a moral compass, reinforcing the values of courage, loyalty, and cunning. And most of all, they were an anchor of identity. For the settlers in remote Greenland, hearing the saga of Leif's voyage to Vinland was not just hearing about an ancestor. It was a reminder of who they were, the descendants of explorers, the people who dared to sail off the edge of the map. The story connected them to their past and justified their precarious present. The oral tradition is a fragile yet resilient keeper of history. With each telling, details might shift, emphasis might change, but the core narrative, the skeleton of the journey, remained. The need for the story to be compelling, to hold the audience's attention through a long night, ensured that the most vital human elements survived: the conflict, the emotion, the sensory details of the wild grapes and the strange scrapings. By the time these tales were finally written down in Iceland 2 centuries later, they were not cold records. They were echoes of those firelit nights, preserving the breath and pulse of the spoken word. So when we read the saga of the Greenlanders today, we are not just reading a historical source. We are listening in on a bedtime story for a whole culture, a story told to remind them of their own bravery in the face of the long, dark unknown. And that tradition of storytelling, of wrapping truth in the cloak of epic narrative, may have traveled farther than we know, leaving its own faint echo in the lands the Norse once visited. The silence of the open ocean is a profound kind of loud. For the Viking navigator standing at the steering oar of a wooden gnaw, the vast grey expanse offered no road signs, no friendly landmarks. Every journey from Greenland to Vinland was a high-stakes act of faith in a deep, accumulated wisdom. Their tools were not brass and glass, but sky and sea. The primary instrument was the sun itself. On clear days, they likely used a simple but brilliant device called a sun shadow board. This was a wooden disc with a central gnomon, a small pin that cast a shadow. By marking the shadow's tip at noon each day, a navigator could maintain a consistent latitude, an east-west line across the ocean. They were, in effect, sailing a line of constant sunlight, holding their course relative to the sun's arc. But the North Atlantic is rarely clear for long. When fog or storms blotted out the sun for days, they turned to a lifetime of learned observation. They watched the waves. The prevailing swell in the North Atlantic comes from the southwest, and a seasoned sailor could feel that rhythm through the ship's hull, using it like a giant, rolling compass even in total blindness. They tasted the air and studied the water's color, knowing that pale, milky green meant ice was near, while a deep blue signaled the warmer currents of the open ocean. They were master readers of the living world. The flight paths of birds were their aerial maps. A sailor knew that certain seabirds, like the puffin, would fly out to sea to feed but always return to land at night. Spotting these birds and noting their direction at dusk could point the way to an unseen shore. Even driftwood carried messages. Finding pine or oak floating in the water told them they were nearing a forested coast, unlike the barren shores of Greenland. At night, they navigated by the stars. They knew the fixed point of the North Star, Polaris, which they called Leitharstjana, the leading star. But they also used other constellations as seasonal guides, their positions telling stories of the turning year and their place upon the endless sea. This was not a single skill, but a symphony of senses. It was a body of knowledge so intimate it was felt in the bones, passed from father to son, from seasoned captain to young deckhand, through stories and proverbs and hard-won experience. A voyage was a collective memory in action. The navigator was the keeper of this lore, trusting not a chart but a story, the story told by the wind on his cheek, the taste of salt, the specific shade of gray in the clouds ahead. He was stitching together a route from 1,000 tiny clues, each one a word in the ocean's silent language. To sail for weeks with no sight of land, placing your survival entirely on these subtle signs, required a courage rooted in profound trust. You had to believe the stories of the old sailors were true. You had to believe the wave pattern would not lie, that the birds would lead you home. It was a conversation with the natural world, a dialogue of immense respect and attention. Their ship did not conquer the Atlantic. It listened to it, and in that listening found a path. This is how a Gnar could set out from the jagged fjords of Greenland and weeks later make landfall on the precise forested coast of Markland. They were not lost because they carried the map in their minds, written in the language of wind, water, and star. Yet this incredible skill raises a haunting question. Such intimate knowledge is fragile. It lives and dies with the people who hold it. What happens when the chain of memory is broken, when the last navigator who knows the old ways finally passes on, leaving only the ghost of a route behind? The longship was the engine of the Viking world. It was their chariot of war, their moving fortress, and most importantly for our story, their vessel of discovery. To cross an ocean like the North Atlantic, however, required a different breed of ship. The sleek, dragon-headed longships of raiding fame were built for speed and shock, for carrying warriors up rivers. For the long haul to Vinland, the Vikings relied on the Gnar. This was the workhorse, the cargo vessel, broader, deeper, and sturdier than a longship. Its design was a quiet marvel of its age. Picture its hull, not carved from a single massive tree, but built up from overlapping planks of oak, fastened together with iron rivets. This is called clinker construction. The genius of it was flexibility. In a heavy sea, the entire hull could twist and flex with the waves like a living creature, rather than fighting against them and risking a catastrophic crack. It was a ship that moved with the ocean, not against it. Standing on the deck of a Gnar in mid-ocean was an experience of raw exposure. There was no enclosed cabin, no shelter from the elements except a small, hide-covered space near the stern. The crew of perhaps 20 to 30 men lived, worked, and slept in the open, exposed to sun, rain, and freezing spray. They took turns at the steering oar, a massive paddle fixed to the starboard side. fighting to keep the ship on course against the relentless push of wind and current. The sail was their primary power, a vast, heavy square of tightly woven wool, treated with animal fat to make it somewhat waterproof. When the wind died, or when navigating through narrow, tricky channels near an unknown coast, they would man the oars, their rhythmic pulls a testament to pure human strength. The sensory world aboard was intense and unchanging. The air was thick with the smell of tarred rope, wet wool, and the sharp, clean scent of salt. The ship itself was a symphony of sound, the constant groan of timber, the slap of waves against the hull, the whistle of wind in the rigging, the creak of oars in their locks. At night, they would huddle under sealskin blankets, the cold seeping into their bones, the stars wheeling overhead in a dizzying display. Their food was simple and durable: dried fish, hard rye bread, sour whey, and smoked meat, washed down with water or weak beer stored in barrels lashed to the deck. Every day was a battle against the elements, a test of endurance where boredom and discomfort could be as dangerous as any storm. To undertake a voyage that could last 6 weeks or more in these conditions required a special kind of fortitude. It was a communal act of faith where every man's life depended on the skill of the navigator and the strength of his shipmates. They were not just sailing across water. They were crossing a threshold of human capability, carried in a shell of wood and iron toward a horizon that held either a new world or a watery grave. The Nar was more than a boat. It was a tiny, mobile fragment of Norse society, carrying their hopes, their technology, and their very way of life across the trackless sea. The fire is the heart of the longhouse, a living, breathing creature of light and heat. Its flames dance in the central hearth pit, a long trench dug into the packed earthen floor, throwing wild, shifting shadows against the curved walls. Those walls are not stone, but a thick, insulating skin of turf and timber, smelling deeply of soil and damp grass. The roof above is a dark mystery, lost in smoke that curls lazily toward the square hole cut for its escape. The air is a rich tapestry of scents: the sharp, clean smell of burning birch wood, the savory steam from a soapstone pot simmering with a stew of cod and wild onions, the underlying, comforting odor of wool blankets and sleeping bodies. You are wrapped in a heavy reindeer hide, your back against a timber partition that separates this sleeping space from the main hall. The ground beneath you is firm, covered in a layer of dry heather and straw that rustles softly with every turn. Around you, the sounds of the settlement at rest settle into a nighttime rhythm. A man snores steadily a few feet away. Another mutters in his sleep, perhaps dreaming of the sea. From outside, muffled by the thick walls, comes the constant sigh of the wind sweeping in from the bay, and the lonely, trembling cry of a loon across the water. It is a profound, secure darkness, punctuated only by the fire's orange glow. The cold of the North Atlantic night is held at bay, defeated by this simple, brilliant architecture of earth and flame. Here, in this pocket of warmth at the edge of a continent, the vast journey feels momentarily suspended. The ship is pulled ashore, the tools are hung, and the only task is to rest. The crackle of the fire becomes a story in itself, each pop and hiss a reminder of the trees that gave themselves to this shelter, the very resource that drew them across the ocean. As your eyes grow heavy, the shadows on the wall seem to shift into shapes: the curve of a ship's prow, the distant outline of a forested hill. The line between the story you are living and the story you are being told gently blurs, and sleep arrives not as an end, but as a deeper layer of the voyage. Listen to the quiet of this new world. For a Norse settler raised on the roar of the North Atlantic, the first sounds of Vinland would have been a profound, almost unsettling symphony. Instead of the relentless crash of surf against the sheer basalt cliffs of home, here the waves met the land with a gentle, rhythmic lap against shores of smooth, rounded pebbles. It was a softer, more intimate conversation between land and sea, and from the forest edge came a sound they had only ever heard in stories: the rustle of countless broad leaves. In Iceland and Greenland, trees were stunted scrub if they existed at all. The whisper of a full canopy of oak and maple in a light breeze was a sound of impossible luxury, a constant, rustling promise of timber and shelter. The air itself was filled with new music, gone were the familiar, harsh cries of gulls and skuas. In their place came the liquid, fluting song of warblers from deep within the thickets, a delicate melody they had no name for. At dusk, the lonely, tremulous call of a loon would echo across the still bays, a sound so haunting and strange it might have seemed like the voice of a spirit guarding the water. The forest floor added its own layer of life, the sudden, chattering scold of a red squirrel, the scratch of a foraging deer in the underbrush, the industrious tap of a woodpecker on a hollow trunk, a whole world of small, busy noises that spoke of abundance. And sometimes, from a great distance, carried on the night wind, would come a sound that froze the blood, the deep, harmonized howl of a wolf pack. In Greenland, the greatest land predator was the fox. This was different, a primordial chorus that spoke of a wilderness on a scale they could barely comprehend. It was a reminder that this land, for all its gentleness, held ancient and powerful rules of its own. This entire soundscape, from the soft lap of the waves to the eerie wolf song, painted Vinland in a dimension beyond sight. It was not just a green and pleasant land. It was a living, breathing, sounding entity, rich with alien beauty and a deep, humming vitality that must have felt both wondrous and deeply foreign to the Norse ear. It was a place that felt truly new, not just in its shape but in its very voice. A strange shape moved where only water and sky had ever met. From the shore, a hunter watching the morning mist clear over the bay would have seen it first, a dark speck that resolved into a form utterly alien. It was not a canoe of hide and bone, sleek and silent. This was a creature of wood and woven cloth, a high-sided vessel with a single, square wing that caught the wind, pushing it toward land with a purposeful speed that felt like a challenge. The first sight of a Viking Nar was not a discovery for those on the land. It was an arrival, an intrusion into a world that was already full of its own names, stories, and people. For thousands of years, the coasts the Norse would name Helluland, Markland, and Vinland had been home. In the frozen north of Baffin Island, the ancestors of the Inuit hunted seal and walrus from their kajaks, masters of an icy world. Further south, in the forests of Labrador and Newfoundland, the Beothuk lived in harmony with the caribou and the rich salmon runs. Along the Gulf of St. Lawrence, the Micmac and their forebears moved with the seasons, their lives woven into the cycles of the birch forests and the tide. These were not empty lands awaiting history. They were ancient, peopled landscapes, every bay and river known, every resource understood. Then the strangers came ashore. Imagine witnessing their disembarkation from behind the screen of pine trees. These men were pale, their faces often hidden by hair the color of rust or dried grass. They wore strange, stiff garments that gleamed dully in the light rings of metal sewn onto cloth. They spoke in guttural, harsh sounds, a language with no music familiar to the ear. They brought with them objects of curious power, axes that could bite deeper into a tree trunk than any stone tool, and lengths of cloth dyed a shocking, vibrant red, a color that seemed to hold the very essence of fire. Initial contact likely pulsed between wary curiosity and mutual need. The Norse had things the local people valued, those strong metal blades, those impossible red fabrics. The indigenous people had what the Norse desperately sought: furs of beaver and fox, warm pelts that represented wealth back across the ocean. Early trade might have been conducted in a tense silence, goods laid on the ground, each party retreating to allow the other to approach. For the indigenous traders, these metal tools were revolutionary. For the Norse, the furs were a fortune. It was a moment of two worlds meeting in a practical, if bewildered, exchange. But this curiosity was shadowed by a deep and growing threat. The Norse worldview was one of ownership and fences. They built permanent longhouses from the towering trees. They pastured their strange, noisy animals on the meadows, and they acted as if the land was now theirs. To the indigenous nations, this was a profound violation. The land was not owned, it was shared, a relative to be respected. These newcomers did not ask. They took, and when challenged, they fought with a terrifying, organized violence, their metal swords and axes cutting in ways that stone weapons could not. The Skraelings, as the sagas call them, were not weak or primitive. They were defenders. They watched the Norse bull terrify their people. They saw the strangers kill over a trivial dispute, and they recognized the pattern of conquest. Their response was not one of panic, but of strategy, using their superior numbers, their knowledge of the terrain, and their own effective weapons like the bow and the sling to harass and besiege the invaders. To include this perspective is not to diminish the Viking achievement, but to complete the circle of the story. It transforms a simple tale of exploration into a complex human drama of encounter. The Norse did not find a wilderness, they stumbled into someone else's home. The conflicts that ended their Vinland dreams were not with a hostile environment, but with a resilient people protecting their world. That first sighting of a square sail on the horizon was not the beginning of history in America. It was a new and ultimately fleeting chapter in a story that had already been unfolding for millennia. By listening for that other shore's story, we hear the full, resonant truth of contact, a moment of awe, of trade, of fear, and of a homeland steadfastly defended. The story of Vinland did not end with the last Norse ship turning for home. It slept for centuries, a seed in the frozen ground of history, waiting for the right conditions to sprout. When it finally did, it changed how we see the map of human discovery. The archaeological confirmation at El Ants Orcs Meadows was more than a fascinating find. It was a quiet revolution. It forced a line in the history books to be redrawn, shifting the first known European contact with the Americas from the tropical Caribbean in 1492 to the windswept coast of Newfoundland around the year 1000. Christopher Columbus did not discover a new world. He rediscovered it, arriving nearly 5 centuries after the Norse had already come and gone. This recalibration gave Leif Erikson a rightful place alongside Columbus, not as a rival, but as a pioneer from a different age, proving that the human drive to explore has many chapters, many names. For millions of people of Scandinavian descent in North America, this was not just a historical correction. It was a profound source of identity and pride. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, as immigrants from Norway, Sweden, and Denmark built new lives in the Midwest and beyond, the Vinland sagas offered a powerful narrative. They were not just newcomers, they were the descendants of the first Europeans to see this continent. This connection to a deep, pre-colonial past helped forge a proud cultural legacy in their adopted homeland. That pride took concrete form in statues of a determined Leif Erikson, gazing westward from the shores of Lake Michigan or standing proudly in Boston. It led to the establishment of Leif Erikson Day, celebrated on October 9th, a recognition woven into the fabric of American civic life. The story became a touchstone, a way to honor the courage of ancestors while celebrating their own place in the modern nation. But the appeal of the Viking Voyages stretches far beyond heritage. It taps into something universal in the human spirit. This is not merely a tale about Vikings. It is a story about us. It is a story of breathtaking courage, the decision to point a wooden ship into the empty Western Ocean, driven by nothing but a rumor and a desperate need for timber. It is a story of wondrous encounter, that heart-stopping moment when a crew first saw the endless forests of Markland, a sight that must have felt like a miracle. And perhaps most importantly, it is a story of profound failure. They found their promised land, they built their homes, they even brought their children into the world there, and yet they could not stay. Their dream was ultimately undone by distance, by conflict, and by the simple, unyielding fact that the land already belonged to someone else. In that failure, the story becomes deeply, powerfully human. It is not a sanitized legend of inevitable triumph. It is a real account of ambition meeting its limits, That is why this mystery holds us. Vinland is a tangible thread connecting our modern, mapped world to the realm of saga and legend. It proves that the boldest leaps into the unknown are not the inventions of poets. They are the actions of real people with families and fears who lived them. The ruins at Meadows are not just an archaeological site. They are a physical bridge. When you stand on that grassy shore in Newfoundland, you are standing on a threshold. On one side is everything we know, every date in every textbook. On the other side is the vast, whispering ocean of what came before, the oral tales, the forgotten journeys, the countless human stories that faded before the written word could catch them. The Viking voyage to America reassures us that some of those stories are true. It tells us that even in a world without satellites or steel ships, the horizon was an invitation, and the greatest human adventures were already underway. Even in a land of such tangible wonders, the Norse mind knew there were older, darker things at the edges of the firelight. The sagas, those vessels of history, also carried ghost stories. Woven into the practical accounts of timber and trade is a chilling tale from the Vinland expeditions, a reminder that for these explorers, the New World was a place of both physical peril and supernatural dread. The story is set during Thorfinn Karlsefni's attempt at colonization. After establishing their settlement, the Norse began to experience a strange and terrifying phenomenon. A mysterious figure started to appear, but only at night. It was described as large-bodied, shadowy, and terrifyingly swift. In its hand, it carried not a sword or an axe, but a wooden scythe, a tool of harvest turned into an instrument of death. This apparition would descend upon the settlement after dark, and wherever it struck, men would fall dead, though no visible wound could be found. The terror was not from a skraeling attack or a wild beast, but from something that felt like a curse upon the land itself, a malevolent spirit defending its territory against the newcomers. Panic spread through the camp. No watchfire seemed bright enough, no wall thick enough to keep this spectral reaper at bay. The saga tells us that the deaths continued until one man, a follower of Karlsefni named Thorhall the Hunter, finally stood up to challenge it. Thorhall was a complex character, a man who still clung to the old pagan gods while others in the expedition were converting to the new Christian faith. Perhaps it was this connection to the older ways that gave him the courage or the recklessness to face the thing. He waited for the creature one night, and when it came, he did not flee. He fought it. The battle was fierce and otherworldly, but in the end, Thorhall drove the entity back and the killing stopped. This brief, eerie interlude is more than just a campfire scare. It is a window into the Norse soul. To them, Vinland was not a blank slate. It was a landscape already full of spirits of landvitir or land wights. By building their homes, cutting its trees, and fencing its meadows, they were intruding into a spiritual ecology as well as a physical one. The ghost with the wooden scythe can be read as the personified wrath of the land itself, fighting back against their colonization in a way that felt more profound than any human enemy. It is a story of psychological haunting, born from the profound dislocation and guilt of being an invader in a deeply ancient place. The fact that it was Thorhall, the pagan, who defeated it adds a poignant layer. It suggests that the old gods and the old magic were still needed to navigate the deepest terrors of this new world, even as the community was slowly turning toward a new religion. So as we near the end of our journey through this mystery, let this ghost story linger for a moment. It completes the portrait of Vinland. It was a land of towering timber and sweet grapes, yes. But it was also a land of strange sounds in the forest, of watchful eyes from the tree line, and of shadows that moved with a purpose all their own. For the Norse, their American dream was always tinged with this haunting atmosphere, a reminder that some frontiers are not just geographical, but exist in the quiet, fearful spaces of the human heart. The final voyage home was a journey in reverse, a retreat from promise back to reality. The ships were pushed back into the cold, familiar water of the bay, their hulls now riding lower, weighted not with dreams but with cargo. They were filled with the practical wealth of Vinland, great logs of oak and pine, bundles of precious furs, and perhaps a few barrels of the tart wild grapes. These were the tokens of their adventure, the physical proof that the stories were true. But the holds felt emptier than they looked. As the crew hauled on the ropes and the square sail caught the wind, every man and woman aboard would have turned for a last look. They saw the silent longhouses, their turf walls already beginning to blend back into the meadow. They saw the fields they had cleared with such hope, where the grass was already reclaiming the turned earth. And on that distant headland, if the light was right, they might have glimpsed the small, stark crosses marking the grave of Leif Erikson, a lonely sentinel forever facing the western sea. There was no triumphant fanfare, no ceremony. The settlement was simply left to the weather and the quiet. The only sound was the creak of the ship and the cry of a gull. Relief was surely there, the relief of surviving, of returning to the known world of family and familiar fjords, away from the constant, watchful tension of this bountiful but defended land. Yet it was a relief tinged with a deep, unspoken grief. They were leaving behind more than buildings. They were abandoning a future. They were sailing away from the possibility of Snorri Thorfinnsson growing up in the land of his birth, from generations of Norse children who would have called this place home. The wind filled the sail, and the coastline of Vinland began to shrink. The forested hills softened into a dark green line, then a hazy smudge on the horizon. Finally, there was only the endless grey of the ocean and the memory of a green shore. The voyage east was a mirror of the original journey, but the feeling aboard was utterly different. They were not pioneers blazing a trail into the unknown. They were survivors carrying a report of failure. They sailed with the weight of what they had learned, that a land could offer everything and still refuse you. For weeks, the Nars rode the swells, the crew falling back into the old rhythms of the open sea, the vast and empty Atlantic performing its ancient role as a barrier. And then the first jagged outline of Greenland appeared, a sight of stark glaciers and bare rock that once meant hardship but now meant safety. They had returned. They brought their timber, their furs, their stories. They brought a baby named Snorri, but they did not bring a colony. In the warm longhouses of Brattahlid and the western settlement, the tales were told and retold. The voyages to Vinland became the greatest of the family sagas, an epic of discovery that ended not with a kingdom founded, but with a door gently closed. The dream did not shatter, it simply faded like a coastline disappearing into the mist, leaving behind only a haunting and beautiful question: what if they had stayed? The final embers of the Vinland dream cooled in the hearts of Greenland. The longships, their timbers seasoned by a new ocean, rested now in familiar fjords. The stories of those western shores were carefully folded into the family sagas, becoming heirlooms of memory more than maps for return. For a few more generations, the boldest among them might still have set sail for Markland, that forested coast on timber-gathering runs, a practical echo of the great adventure. But the grand project of settlement, of building a new Norse world in Vinland, was over. The door they opened remained ajar for a time, a draft of possibility from the west, until slowly, quietly, it closed. The turf walls at Elant's Ox Meadows sank into the peat, and the only sound was the wind where their voices had been. Yet a story told is a kind of immortality. The mystery of the Viking voyages to America, once dismissed as mere legend, has been reclaimed by the earth itself and the patience of scholars. It is a verified chapter in the long book of human daring, written not in ink but in the ghostly outlines of those northern longhouses and the weathered pages of the sagas. It reminds us that history is not a straight line but a tapestry of forgotten threads, some of which against all odds are found again. So as this tale ends and the night deepens, let the rhythm of that ancient journey carry you. Feel the steady pull of the oars in calm water, the deep, rolling swell of the North Atlantic beneath you, the sigh of wind in a woolen sail. Hear the distant whisper of the Vinland forests, a promise of green from a far shore. Let these sensations, drawn from a 1,000-year-old voyage, soften the edges of your own world. Allow the courage of those explorers, their wonder, and even their acceptance of a dream deferred to settle around you like a well-worn cloak. May your sleep be as deep and restorative as a safe harbor after a long sea crossing, and may your dreams be filled with the quiet thrill of horizons yet unseen. Good night.